On the 7th of December 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service launched a surprise attack against the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, which consequently forced America to participate in the Second World War. The attack on Pearl Harbor was considered to be treacherous as it was carried out before Japan declared war on America, aiming to weaken American forces first. The Japanese believed that an attack on Pearl Harbor would be beneficial in their attempts to conquer Southeast Asia and the Dutch Indies and Malaya. Following the embargo of oil supplies to Japan by the U.S., they aimed at weakening the American Navy, which would prevent interference by the Americans within the Pacific, and also believed that the attack would demoralize American morale, thinking the Americans would take back the order to embargo Japan. The overall goal of the Japanese army was to immobilize the Pacific American fleet for 6 months, which they estimated would be enough time to complete their conquest of Southeast Asia. The Japanese trained their pilots well, with planning and training for the attack taking almost a year as the pilots practiced low-altitude torpedo runs to destroy battleships, as well as high-altitude precision bombing to destroy their main targets, which were the United States aircraft carriers. Their plan was to attack in 2 separate waves, with the first wave to act as the primary attack, while the second wave targeted aircraft carriers, cruisers and battleships. The Americans suffered heavily, losing 2,335 servicemen and 68 civilians, with another 1,178 wounded. 8 battleships were damaged and 5 were sunk, while 3 light cruisers and 188 aircraft.
No need to emphasize the extent of the damage. No need to underline that the Japanese bombs did their work well. You see it. You get it like a heavy blow right between the eyes. And you see its effect in the Philippines, Malaya and the Dutch East Indies.
Pearl Harbor was potentially the biggest factor that brought upon the closure of the Second World War, as it forced the major force of America to participate in the war, adding extreme power to the Allies. Although the US were providing the British with military support against the Axis powers, they were not fully invested in the war until their hand was forced by Japan. Despite the American supply ships being destroyed on their way to British troops, it was not enough for America to involve itself in the war. During World War II, America was on top of the world economically as it is now, giving it the ability to outproduce both Japan and Germany. On December 8, 1941, the day after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt declared war on Japan following the famous infamy speech.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation.
Without the events of Pearl Harbor, America would not have dismantled its Neutral Act, which was declared by Roosevelt when the war broke out in 1939. Pearl Harbor was potentially the biggest factor that brought upon the closure of the Second World War, as it forced the major force of America to participate in the world, adding extreme power to the Allies. Contrary to the Japanese plan of demoralizing American morale by attacking Pearl Harbor, it created the opposite effect, uniting the American people, fueled by anger and betrayal behind their president. In the final months leading up to the attack, the U.S. government issued a memorandum stating, "The Japanese government does not desire or intend or expect to have forthwith armed conflict with the United States." The people of America were so enraged that following the declaration of war, millions of men signed up immediately, with some even lying about their age, while women went right to work in the factories to supply the army. Pearl Harbor was always frequently used within American propaganda posters empowering the American people. Although it can be argued that by the time that America had entered the war, there was already a change in tide in the war, as Germany had failed to invade Britain. The involvement of America into the war brought upon a bigger change in the course of war. The Americans mobilized 16 million soldiers and had impeccable war production, with the Willow Run plant in Michigan producing a B-24 heavy bomber every hour. In just 4 years, the U.S. was able to produce more airplanes than all of the major war powers combined, and by 1944 America had the largest navy in history at the time, with more than 6,000 ships. The US also helped countless Allied countries, mainly Britain and the Soviet Union, by assisting them through Lend-Lease with $31.4 billion worth of resources given to Britain, $11.3 billion given to the Soviet Union, $3.2 billion to France, $1.6 billion to China, and $2.6 billion to other Allied forces. British Prime Minister Churchill referred to it as the most unselfish and unsordid financial act of any country in all history. Following the death of Franklin Roosevelt, the US had provided the Soviet Union with 400,000 heavy trucks, 2,000 locomotives, 11,000 railcars and billions of dollars worth of planes, tanks, food and clothing, while also producing 20% of Britain's ammunition. Without the help of America, Britain would not have been able to survive. And the Soviet Union would not have been able to defeat Germany, making Pearl Harbor a significant turning point as America displayed its full power. Russian historian Boris Vadimovich Sokolov says that without these Western shipments under Lend-Lease, the Soviet Union not only would not have been able to win the Great Patriotic War, it would not have been able even to oppose the German invaders. Pearl Harbor allowed for the US and Britain to fully unite against the Axis powers, and without the US, Britain would have collapsed or become a vassal of Germany. Together, US and Britain invaded Italy and Germany through Operation Torch, North African Landings, and Operation Overlord, Normandy Landings. America not only helped in the fight against Italy and Germany, but also solely battled Japan in the Pacific, protecting not only Southeast Asia, but Australia as well. The impact of Pearl Harbor is imminent just 6 months after the attack, with America in a decisive naval battle against Japan in what would be another vital turning point in the war, the Battle of Midway. The Japanese plan was similar to their approach with Pearl Harbor: deliver a devastating blow to the Americans and they would back away, giving Japan free rein over the Pacific. However, the Americans defeated the Japanese and inflicted devastating damage to the Japanese fleet, with military historian John Keegan deeming it the most stunning and decisive blow in naval warfare history. With the Japanese suffering heavy losses, the US Navy was able to push back Japan and regain control over the Pacific. Japanese Admiral Isoroku, who planned the attack on Pearl Harbor, would later write in his diary, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Conrad the 100th Crane believes that Pearl Harbor was the true early turning point of the war, and it was not until America joined the fight that it truly became a world war. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor brought the United States into the war in such a way that it was fully mobilized and fully antagonized, and eventually it's going to have a major influence in both theaters of the war. Meanwhile, presidential historians such as Robert Dallek believe that Pearl Harbor cannot be considered a turning point in the war, as America was already bound for war regardless. I think the United States would have gotten into the war anyway, because the Japanese were intent on delivering a blow to American power in the Pacific. Overall, Pearl Harbor was a significant turning point during World War II, as it was the cause for the many effects that occurred after it, such as the slow regain of control by the Allies, the Battle of Midway, D-Day, and the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that ultimately put an end to the war, which would not have arrived as quickly without the powerful participation of America forced by Japan.